everyone, and hello, Lawrence. Thank you for being with us.
No worries. Happy to be here, Dave.
Awesome. So we're going to dive in and actually, I already see a bunch of questions so far. We have 11 questions asked. So as folks, as you're thinking about questions that you want to get answers to, or maybe follow-ups to things that you hear Lawrence share, feel free to put them in the Q&A button in the bottom left. Click on that button. You'll see a list of questions, and you're welcome to upvote other people's questions. So I'd love to get started with actually just like the quick sort of high level, like tell us about yourself, things that you might imagine folks you might want to know, and just kind of start from there.
Yeah, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's great to see people from all over the world. I am joining you all from usually sunny, but today not so sunny, Oakland, California, up in the hills. So I see we have a few other people from Oakland joining. So, I am the CTO of Optimizely. I've been at Optimizely about 6 months. And about the past 10 years or so, I've been in various engineering, kind of head of overall engineering leadership roles. Before Optimizely, was at WeWork, leading a major piece of their technology build out when that company was in a hyper growth mode. Before then, I was at a pure SaaS company called ClearSlide. And before then, I was actually in the security space for a while at Symantec, where I came in through the acquisition of a company called Vontu. You can see all this on my LinkedIn anyway, but that's kind of the head of engineering, CTO part of my career. And it's all been in the Bay Area. I'm originally from, actually I was originally born in Hawaii, but I grew up in San Diego. And then I went to college at Harvey Mudd in the LA area. And then about a few years after college, I moved up to the Bay Area, and it's been pretty much Bay Area ever since. And it's actually, up until recently, it's been pretty much downtown San Francisco ever since. So for those of you who are either from the city or spend a lot of time there, it's just basically me moving from various dots, south of Market here, then a few blocks, and up here, then over here. I remember initially coming up and thinking that I would have to, at some point, like when I first moved up, there was like no tech in the city. It was like a bunch of bankers, some media. I thought eventually I'm going to have to start commuting down to the South Bay. And I just kind of put it off for a while. And thankfully the tech moved up. And so it's pretty much been San Francisco the whole time. Of course, now we're all just hanging out in our homes. So it's quite different. But that's a little bit about me. And, I guess during the course of this hour, you'll probably learn how I think about software engineering and building teams, but that's kind of the outside picture.
Very cool. It's funny because I had the kind of the opposite, which was starting in Mountain View in the South Bay in the suburby area, because it's like heart of Silicon Valley. I'm like, oh, it's so pretty and there are trees and parking and blah, 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 and then seeing at least startup lands, folks trickling up to the city in droves. And now it's kind of like really only the really large companies that are still in like the Valley. So yeah. I guess it ended up working out for you in terms of location.
Yeah, at least in that chapter. And now we're in this next chapter where we'll see
what is location, right? Deep philosophical question.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. And we actually have the most upvoted question is like the best tee up ever, which is cool. In practice, how do you define philosophy of management? How you distinguish it from, say, just habits?
Yeah, well, I think about it as far as what are your core principles? Like the word philosophy is an interesting one, but I also just replace it with like, what are my core tenets or principles for how I do my job? And my job happens to be engineering leadership and management. So therefore it's, how do I do that? And so it's, what are the principles that I could take from environment to environment that would kind of be the underpinnings of everything else I'm doing? And even if I'm adapting things because this one's a startup, this one's a bigger company, this one's all remote, this one's all together, different kind of technology, like what would be the same? And it's got to be something kind of a fundamental principle, almost like these are my top 3 or 4 principles. If I was writing a manifesto, what would that be like? And I think if you do that, you'll find that those are going to be pretty fundamental beliefs about how things should be done, and not kind of more tactical habits. Like something like, I tend to have one-on-ones with people every week. Like that's a habit. Maybe you've built that up and you think that's really good, and you think that people who don't do that often enough are making a mistake. But that's kind of, there's probably a reason below that makes you think that's really important. So kind of trying to find the fundamental whys behind those habits would be the way I think to distinguish it. I don't know, what do you think?
That's interesting. So when I hear the word principle, I'm immediately reminded of Principles by Ray Dalio.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've read it, but this idea of like setting these principles as kind of almost the most important thing when you're going into anything work related, and that if you're clear and explicit about those principles, then you'll find that the organization around you and the culture you're setting underneath you will tend to adhere to those principles. Whereas if you aren't explicit and you aren't having that clear conversation with at least yourself to determine what those principles are, that kind of culture defines itself. And sometimes the things that get defined aren't always as great as you would like.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of just like the culture just kind of happens to you instead of
Yeah.
you being more intentional around it.
Right.
I don't know. I think I started to think about this more after actually going through some more kind of job search interview cycles where I realized I was being asked this. And maybe, you know, if you rewind a few iterations of my career, I was kind of winging those answers. And I had a feeling that, you know, maybe I was good at certain aspects of management, some things I need to get better at. And I'd be trying to articulate that in an interview. And I realized I was kind of making it up as I went along. I'm like, okay. I really need to have my kind of top points in my head, convince myself that those are the right things. And then, you know, this is going to be really, really easy to talk about it. And then of course, you know, so it kind of came up very tactically, like, let's interview better. And then I realized it was actually much better when I joined that new company, and it was much better talking to my peers outside. And so it kind of, you know, from there became a clearly more useful thing, you know?
Sure, completely. So this is great. There's so many more topics. We actually already have 18 questions, so I want to dive through them. Briefly,
Wow.
before I do, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, Lohika, who are wonderful engineering services built for a singular purpose, which is to help VPEs and CTO clients grow by scaling their engineering organizations through core services and people, et cetera. So thank you, Lohika, for your gracious sponsorship. So with that, moving on, what are the most effective ways to share your philosophy with your team, and what strategies have worked best?
Yeah, so I've ended up writing some of this stuff down for my own use. And depending on the culture of the team I'm working with, I feel like it needs to be delivered verbally or it can be delivered in a written form. So that's where I feel like it's okay to adapt. Some cultures are more like document-based cultures where you have a lot of Google Docs floating around. People comment and they, you know, spend a lot of time asynchronously before they get together and discuss something. And other cultures are more like, hey, let's just get together. Let's have live synchronous voice protocol, as I call it, and really get into it. And so I think depending on those is the best, you know, is going to affect the best way to get your message across. But I think either way, as the leader, you need to have in your head, and which means it's probably written down somewhere, at least for you, what things are most important to you and what core principles are most important to you. So I always have something written down, and it's in my personal Google Docs, and it evolves over time. And that's, but it's not really long, you know, it's a page and a half or something like that. It's evolved over time, but it's kind of my personal reminder of what I stand for. And then, yeah, how I choose to put that out there is different. Maybe one other difference is how much you would show up and just be like, hey, I'm here, and here's what I stand for. And how broadly would you talk about that? Like, would you talk about that with your entire company, your entire team, or more with the people you're working closely with? I usually do both. You know, I kind of start off with talking to people who I'm going to be working very closely with, who might report to me directly, and make sure they understand, and they can therefore help kind of amplify the message when I'm making it more clear to a broader set of people.
I'm curious, you mentioning this Google Doc, like if you have a set of actual principles or, you know, core philosophies that you might want to share for yourself. Not saying that like everyone has to adopt everything you have, but I find that folks have a story regarding like how some of these principles get developed. So if you reflect for yourself, maybe what are some of the most important principles to you? If not the whole list, up to you. You know, I imagine a lot of folks would be curious.
Yeah, I figured this might come up, and so yeah, without like, you know, screen sharing it or anything or like reading it all, I'll give you a couple of high points, and then yeah, this might provoke more questions. But one of them is really specific. Well, you could argue whether it's specific to how kind of software engineering teams should be run versus just management in general. But I really believe super strongly in self-organizing teams. And I think I got into this when I really started to embrace Agile and realized that what I thought I had been doing was not Agile and was more kind of mini waterfall. I got into like actual Agile, and then realized that I think what I thought was the underpinning of that was actually having teams that are self-driven, self-organized, self-managing, and they can rally around a certain higher level goal and figure out how to accomplish that, and figure out if they want to go fast or, you know, do something big, small. They can do all those things independently. And I had a lot of success in making organizations that way. So they became like my biggest thing. If I saw setups that were trying to be more kind of command and control, where you have all the orders, dispatched from above, and they all go down the chain of command, and that people at the bottom of the organization just execute. I just saw how that was just fundamentally flawed, but it keeps coming up. And you think maybe we'd be all beyond that by now, but it keeps coming up in a lot of organizations. So that's probably the biggest one. Is if you believe in that and kind of go with that worldview, then leadership's job, it changes. It's vision and very high level goal setting, but then it's like, how do you actually have a culture where these self-organizing teams can thrive? How do you form them? How do you decide how to, they still need like management and support. So how do you do that? So that's probably the number one. And then maybe just a couple other ones I'll throw out there, and then I'll step off the soapbox for a minute. But I think, so having these self-organizing teams means that teams can have their own goals. And so team goals become more important than individual goals. And that's another thing that I just feel strongly about. I feel like the more you get teams of people, the right size, kind of really working together, and it's a team more than a group, you should be looking at what their highest priorities are, and the team should be rallying around the highest priority, as opposed to, this engineer works on this engineer works on this, and then, in the spirit of giving everybody something to lead, but then it gets like really distributed. It's unclear what the highest priority is. Are you starting a lot of things but not finishing a lot of things? Like those kind of things. I feel like having team goals is a really, really big part of that. So yeah, let me pause there. Probably a bunch of other stuff I could say, but that's probably the biggest one. Sure. That it's in my belief system.
For sure. And it's great that you explicitly call out like team goals matter, in that it seems obvious, but there are such a large number of folks, particularly those who over-index on the like, make sure my team feels good and is nurtured, et cetera, that over-index on an individual's ability to achieve the things that they want for their job and their career and their growth. The most recent example of this I recall for myself, talking with a mentee on Plato. This is a VP of engineering at like maybe like a 50-ish person startup, and he was mentioning that one of the people on his team wanted to leave, and part of that was because he wasn't like learning the stuff that he wanted to learn. And the initial inclination was, oh gosh, let's find a project that lets him, he was excited about, some particular type of front end technology that wasn't React. And he was like, well, I want to give him an opportunity to learn this, et cetera. But the actual needs and goals of the team had no interest or opportunity or need for that technology, right? And this is where I think if you define clearly that philosophy as you just stated, then there's a clear winner, right? Of like, and essentially it's like, what do you say then? You say, okay, we don't have this opportunity right now, and maybe there's a way to explore it, and or maybe you have to think about if you still want to be here, et cetera. But I appreciate the idea that like acknowledging this explicitly, that matters, that team priorities matter, is a thing, and not everyone does it.
Yeah, and there's a balance, right? Because you could go too far the other way, which is saying, hey, you're on this team is supposed to do X. Here's the top priorities for team X, and that's all you should be doing in that stack rank, regardless of what you want to do. And that doesn't work either. Really talented engineers want to be challenged. They want to have, they can get stale on certain teams. They need to be pushed to get to the next level in the kind of their career ladder. So that's where engineering managers still have this huge role to play to really sniff out the motivations of people on their team, the mix of seniority and juniority, and like just how it's all going to work out with the team goals in mind. So there's still a lot of art to it. You can't like ignore what people's individual needs are, but it's just kind of like taking a step back and saying, okay, yeah, we're doing all this stuff, but it's still in spirit of these team goals, and are we still making progress on those? And that's the ultimate kind of measuring stick.
100%. Totally makes sense. So moving on with questions, how would you characterize the split between CTO and VP of engineering responsibilities at Optimizely?
Good question. Yeah, I got this question even when I joined around what the expectations are of this role, because previously there was an SVP of engineering, and then one of the co-founders of Optimizely held the CTO title. And I think the CTO versus VP of engineering roles it's kind of morphed over time in my kind of 20 years in the industry, 20 plus years, where it used to be that the CTO was like a very technically focused, sometimes almost purely outbound, sometimes almost purely inbound, kind of IC role. And the head of engineering or the VP engineering was the organizational leader. And over time, like sometimes you still see that very clear split, but sometimes you see that morphing into a singular role. And that's kind of the person who oversees everything, but also has a strong technical vision about things. So that's how I'd put myself in that bucket. And I think that's why I was, that matched the optimize these needs. And so that's why it worked out is, to really own the organization and how it's going to evolve and how it's going to thrive, but also have a very strong opinion about the technical strategy of the products and how we're building things. And the way I think about that is I'm not the one who's in there, trying to outcode my team or be the ultimate architect, but I'm going to pressure test a lot of stuff, especially on the architecture. I want to be able to understand exactly why we're doing things the way we are and really ask those kind of tough questions and pressure test things. And sometimes it'll actually influence and change decisions, but that's not the goal. The goal is to make sure that the team that is there feels like I really understand what their challenges are. I understand the problem. I have a stake in it. I'm not just going to go on, consensus. What do you all think? So that's kind of how I blend the technical aspects with the organizational aspects. But at the same time, running a big organization, that is a huge job, and you got to do a lot of stuff just to make sure that is healthy and thriving. So it's a tough balance, but I actually feel that the combo role, if you want to call it that, is actually really. I actually think it's the right model for a lot of companies. I'll put it that way. And
Yep.
I'm personally having a great time with it.
That's great. It's interesting because I imagine most of the folks that are connected who have either served in a VP of engineering or CTO role, or who are in a small startup for which there is somebody in their chain of command who serves either of those roles or both of those roles. For sure, most of us have Googled difference between CTO and VP of engineering, right? Yeah. And most of us read these same blogs or articles that talk about exactly what you described, right? That VP of engineering is kind of more focused on the people management, and the CTO is more focused on the technical thing. And like once in a while, there's that rare blue moon where somebody can serve both of those roles. And just to confuse things further, that person tends to be called CTO, because there's a chief in the title, right? And so the thing that I appreciate though, is, particularly folks just dialed into this conversation, they're looking for models, and they're looking for like what's normal, what's typical, and it evolves over time and changes over time, right? And I think what I'm hearing from you is that what's normal, typical, and what works for Optimizely and other companies is to have those roles merge, but that's particularly because you're capable of doing both of those roles, right? And not every organization has somebody who is capable, and because of the beauty of the Dunning-Kruger effect, feel free to Google that if you're not familiar. There are plenty of people who maybe think that they're both or identify as both, but may have so little knowledge about one of them that they think that they're good at it because they don't have enough knowledge to assess that they're good at it, and that's called Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah. Well, it's also a little bit about like making sure they're not overly divided though either, because I've seen cases of where you have somebody in a CTO role and somebody in a VP of engineering role, and they're almost like so clear, like I play this position, they're so fundamentally different that the interplay is lost. Like you have to build an organization with technology goals in mind. It's not just outputting code and outputting features and then turning a crank. So the strategy really is part of that. And so I feel like they really have to work well together. So I think the times when I've seen it work well together with two people, they are really, really close peers. They communicate really well. And the times when, of course, we can all probably think of these cases where it goes south is when they're like totally different islands. And you can even suss that out sometimes in interviews where you maybe, there's a company, usually a startup, highly technical, really smart founder, CTO type, like, hey, could you join this company and like help us out with that people stuff? Like, yeah, well, I could, but like, let's talk about how we work together and like what we're trying to build here, and really bring it together more. I think that's the model of success, whether it's one person or two or more.
100%. Awesome. So moving on, how do you think about your management philosophy on in-house teams vis-a-vis outsourced teams or teams supplemented by a vendor?
Great question. Yeah, I feel that you have to think of this all the same way, especially for, again, this is because we're talking about software engineering. It really requires, there's a high level of ambiguity, uncertainty in the work. There's a high level of trust you have to have with the people. This is not like factory assembly line stuff. So I think all of the same principles that you have around a self-organized team that is, full-time employees of your company in your same office versus, something very different remotely, maybe they don't work for your company, are, you really want the same motion to get the same result. So the times I've done, working with an outsourced vendor, it's been in this kind of team augmentation model where they are willing to, they have really good people, but they're willing to learn your process and really understand how you want to work. And like, are you using Scrum or Kanban, or like, how do you want to work with PMs and designers? And they'll understand that and they'll actually make it work with you. So it's more like a team extension. And those are the times that I've actually found it work very well. And so 2 companies ago, actually, so you mentioned, Lohika, sponsor of this podcast or Q&A, but I used them to great success a couple of companies ago at ClearSlide. And actually it was one where I inherited a San Francisco only local team, and not with the desire to save costs, but with the desire to grow the team in a more effective way, get it distributed, get an increased hiring pipeline. I chose to build this team in the Ukraine. And we built it in the image of, these self-organizing teams and with the agile process we had. And we were kind of moving to DevOps at the time and kind of with that in mind. And the right vendor, flexed with us and learned with us. And we had, so not only did it kind of snap into our process well, but also I feel that if you do that kind of thing, you retain the best kind of talent on the vendor side. These vendors they have their own job, which is to get the best, most talented engineers into their company, wherever they are. And what can happen is if you don't set things up right, or you don't give them the right kind of work, those people will attrit. And they might not leave that outsourced company, but they might say, hey, I want to move to this other project. And that kind of churn can really be the bane of any kind of offshoring. So one way to really minimize that is to have, good work, good kind of component or module ownership with a team over there, wherever there is, and you actually keep the best people. So these are all kind of the things I found really work well, but it still kind of comes down to like treating them not really differently than you treat your own teams.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because the way that you describe it almost sounds like, outsourced vendors that are particularly effective, whether it be Lohika or others, kind of functions almost like stem cells, that like you put them close with a team that has a preset culture, and whether they are in Ukraine or in anywhere around the world, they are able to meld and merge with the existing culture and just kind of function as part of the team and still operate independently with their own, if they're independently driven, as you kind of described as your model, they're able to just do that naturally and organically with the folks around them.
Yeah, and so that cultural norming is a big part of it. So again, back in the days before February, when we could fly around more freely, I was really big on that. So, when we had these teams in the Ukraine spin up, we'd have the leads and actually a few of the other people like fly over and spend, multiple weeks in our San Francisco office, really, getting to know the team, working alongside them, just like, not, it's much different when you're actually working side by side with somebody and don't just have meetings scheduled. You just kind of work in there and you have a question and then you walk over and you talk to that person. So making those investments, which, that's a lot of upfront investment to spin up a team, but doing those things, I felt really, really paid off. Of course, now we have to like fundamentally rethink that in the new world. But, I think all those investments make it, again, feel more like a team that is just like another one of your teams, and not like, those other people.
Sure. So this next question is kind of in a somewhat similar vein, which is, how does a personal management philosophy compare to the philosophy of change with the surroundings or people or environment, business needs, et cetera?
Yeah. So I think one way I try to suss that out is it's helpful if you've had a leadership role at a couple of different companies. So you can just look at your own track record and compare, like what felt to you like it was durable across those things, because those companies were probably pretty different in some ways. And so what really translated well and what did you need to adapt? But then that gets back to that question around habits versus, your fundamental principles. So the whole thing I talked about around self-organizing teams, that is something that I feel so strongly about, that there's nowhere I would join and thrive at and be the right hire for that didn't believe in that. You know, if it's like, actually, you know what, we like command and control. We like, you know, we don't really want teams to kind of make their own decisions. We want them to, you know, execute clearly on this set of requirements. It wouldn't be something where there's like an adaptation to make. It would be like fundamentally against my worldview. And I would just tell them like, I'm not the right leader for you. But there's a lot that you do have to adapt from place to place. And also, you know, even over time, the environment changes. So there's things that I used to think were pretty good strategies that I think the environment, like the market, maybe changed, and I had to adapt those things. So a lot of the stuff you write down, you have, like, that's the challenge, is like trying to abstract it sufficiently so you think it really is durable. And even then you're going to change that stuff. So maybe a little bit of it is like, don't take it as like you're writing some gospel, but you're just writing something to keep yourself kind of checked in your own head and make sure you have some fundamentals that you're carrying along.
Sure. You know, it's interesting because, and I come up with really random analogies that are completely unrelated to like engineering world, but somehow seem to, you know, make things relate. And I think about how, you know, as engineers, we tend to like having black and white answers to things, very clear yes, no. When we're in, you know, listening to conversations like this, we're looking for the absolute, like, am I doing this the right way or the wrong way? Like, you know, Lawrence, share me the vision of what's the right way and what's the wrong way, right? But the vibe that you're kind of alluding to is that it's really, you know, it's more about having clear principles and finding a match or compatibility with those principles, as opposed to some kind of absolute. I think the analogy that I was thinking about was as it relates to like relationships in general, right? Like sometimes we think to ourselves that, and this could be whether romantic or regular, you know, non-romantic relationship, you know, that there's some kind of absolute for somebody to be, for somebody that we're working with or that we're with in our lives. And the reality is that that's not the question. It's not about finding some kind of absolutes. It's about compatibility. It's about sharing values, sharing goals, right? And as a result, like, it doesn't matter, like, whether you're in software or you're in hardware, or whether you're in, you know, one vertical or another, like, what matters is that you have that compatibility of values and interests. And that, like, what you describe with, you know, self-organizing teams, and actually just philosophy in general, like a word that I like to use to describe this sort of thing is like pattern matching, right? That you've had all of these different scenarios or situations where you've seen this way of structuring be very successful. And so you have this pattern matching that when you have folks who are in teams like this, they're likely to be successful. And as a result, if you end up interviewing with a company and you find that, like, their team and company and organization has a very different set of patterns that they match to, you may find that it's not a fit, and you probably interview somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it, you know, it is a lot about pattern matching and trying to, again, you know, the more you have a couple of different stints, the easier it is to do this, but trying to divorce the overall success of the company or the project from what you did as much as possible. Because, you know, you can definitely have this kind of attribution bias where you had this one startup, it ended up not going so well. And so, you know, everything you did there is a big question mark. And actually, meanwhile, you're over here and your timing was right. And like, this company went IPO and it was awesome. And therefore everything you did there must have been really the right call. And you were the best manager or leader ever. And like, just really checking yourself and trying to tease apart, like, what did you really do that was affected the outcome? Would you, you know, what learnings from the failed one were still like really good things that you felt good about and are gonna, would you at your next job proudly?
I love that you mentioned attribution bias, because it's like such a common thing, particularly in Silicon Valley, right? When you have folks who go off and they like strike it rich with their startup, and like, it's very easy to convince yourself, like, if you're in some wildly successful thing. I mean, actually, I did this like in year 2 on Gmail, right? Like, I joined whatever, like a year or 2 after it had started, still early days, and like, it was wildly successful. And like, I thought, okay, everything that we're doing must be right because we're seeing this success, right? But then when I went to like a startup and I took some of these structures, paradigms, models that were, you know, Google, I don't know, had like 3,000 people or something at that point, and it didn't work, right? And like similarly, you may find that you do something that you see time and time again is successful. For example, like even structuring the teams as you described in a self-organizing way, and you have failure. And because of the attribution bias, you might go, oh, I shouldn't have structured things that way, right? But it's like, no, confounding variables. You know, if you separate things out, you might find that, I mean, actually this happened like with my first job as an engineer. You know, I was audio intern at NVIDIA, which is like, you know, yeah, they did audio back in the day for cell phones back before smartphones. And like, I was like kind of miserable, and so I thought, oh, is this what life is like as an engineer? Maybe I shouldn't do this. And like, then kind of went into product for my first full-time job. But then later on in life, a couple of years later, kind of discovered I really missed coding, et cetera, and fell in love with it. So that idea of attribution bias, of separating out like what you're doing and the results, and that those two things may not correlate. They may not, one may not be actually leading to the other. It may just be something else
yeah. Well, and it's funny because, you know, now at Optimizing, I'm at this company that is all around the scientific method and rigorous statistics telling you, you know, the result of an A/B test, and, you know, not letting, you know, small numbers of samples really skew you. And so, but the thing about your career is you just don't have, you know, N is not sufficiently high to do, you know, real kind of analysis. So you have to go on something more, you have to take a different approach. And I think that's where you have to kind of look within yourself and think about what's most important to you, and, you know, what you would, again, like, just even if you're not being interviewed, just like you're interviewing yourself, what would you really take, you know, to the next place and you feel strongly about, you want to build on, and what are you actually going to really adapt? And you just, and, you know, talk to people, like you use, you know, forums like this or other, you know, networking ways to make sure you're not reinventing the wheel or getting feedback, but you have to have a different approach. Unfortunately, the, you know, two or three data points isn't going to tell, you know, isn't going to be a conclusive A/B test here.
Totally, 100%. Great. Does your management philosophy apply to your direct reports only, or to your whole organization? If the latter, how do you manage if your directors or managers don't share exactly the same principles?
Yeah, I think it really has to apply to everyone, but how effectively you can do that, you know, depends. So, you know, obviously the biggest impact you can have is working with your direct staff, and I do a lot of that. So probably, you know, relative to the average leader, I would say I spend more time with my direct reports as a group, and really do what I can to make sure we're working properly as a team, that we're sharing things across with each other, that there's people who are driving initiatives that are outside of their, you know, that help the entire organization, not just their part of it. So, you know, I do a lot of that. But then, you know, part of that is leading by example and showing people, hey, that's what I expect. And so therefore, you know, you with your management team or with your team of engineers, you know, that I'm expecting something similar. I'm expecting, you know, no silos, no hoarding of information, do the right thing for the business, not just for your team. And so those things kind of trickle down. And then you can kind of augment that by talking about that, you know, a bit broadly. But, you know, it's never going to be perfect. The bigger organization gets, there's going to be some pocket where, you know, you, especially if you do some sampling or auditing and, you know, walk the halls, you're going to realize, oh, wow, that's not how I would have done it. And then you have to really check yourself. Like, do I want everyone to be exactly like me here? Or if, as long as they're following a couple of key principles that are the most important things to me, then we're good. And so I think that's the kind of check and balance you have to do. But, you know, there are times, again, where you'll find something that's different than how you would have done it, but you take a step back, realize it's okay. There's other times where you might audit your organization and realize, actually, boy, that's like against my worldview. That's like a no-go. Like, let's address that and figure out how to really change that now.
It makes sense. So the takeaway I get is that, you know, there's, of your core principles or values, there's kind of a set of them that may be like true deal breakers if the folks on your team don't really truly share them. And there may be a set that are more, that are still important. But like, if there's some kind of fundamental core value or belief that conflicts with that from someone on your team, that it might still be navigable. And you kind of have to ask yourself for a given principle or a given person, like, can I live with this or not? And this is why, you know, sometimes you find that when you have a new leader come in, if they really strongly care about a certain value or principle or way of doing things, that sometimes it is intractable. Sometimes it's not going to work out. But other times you find that there's a way to navigate through it. And I guess that
Yeah. Yep.
you have to have the conversation, right? About if it's going to work and what are your.
I think that's right. It's a conversation. It's a process. There's no, like, oh, let me see your documents. Okay, cool. It looks like 0.4, not for me. And it's never that black and white. And so it's also around how, as a leader, you assess this stuff. Do you just assume it's all happening, or what are the methods you have for seeing if what you think everyone should be doing is actually reaching everybody? Do they hear it? Do they agree with it? If they have feedback, is it reaching you? Like all of those mechanisms are pretty important for this topic.
100%. So we got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to start going through a little bit of a semi-lightning round.
I love it.
Folks these questions as you want, because we won't be able to get through all of them. But so any tips for marrying engineering metrics with hiring/culture? E.g., what are some of the most effective ways to engender focus on metrics?
Got it. So I'm interpreting the question is not around engineering metrics around hiring, but how you actually, if you want a good metrics mindset, how do you kind of hire for that, and how do you have a cultural set for that to make sure that's kind of
that's my interpretation as well. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I think you just have to interview for it like you interview for anything else. I think this is a case where kind of behavioral interviewing is the most important. Right. I think, there's a lot of stuff in our industry where you have like the coding focused interview, maybe the more design architecturally focused interview. And then you have another one, which is really more of a conversation. At least it feels very conversational, but it's a very focused behavioral interview by a good interviewer to kind of drill into parts of someone's experience and find out like how they overcame a certain challenge, or so that how they, executed a certain project. And so that's where you want to really focus on these aspects that are really most important to your culture. And so if having somebody have a real metrics focus is really important, that's where you'd really drill into something in their past and try to get a real sense, and with concrete real things. What were the measurables? How, did you know it was successful? What were the business outcomes? Who objected to those? How hard was it to measure? And then you spend your hour on that. And I think that's how you can really do that, kind of on the hiring side. On the cultural side, I think you just have to make it clear it's really important. And just saying metrics are important doesn't really help. You have to demonstrate that by having metrics that you pay attention to and you hold people accountable to, and you don't kind of lose interest in. So I've always been around having a small number of important metrics. So right now, probably the biggest one I think we're focused on at Optimizely is lead time. And again, this is not revolutionary, and I'm a big fan of the work that happened with Accelerate and with Dora. And so all those key measurables being most correlated with high-performing teams. But lead time is the one where I feel like right now we have the most work to do at Optimizely, and so we're focusing on it the most. And so, the more I pay attention and my leaders pay attention to that and keep our eye on the ball, and if those trend properly, then we're a little less focused on how somebody solved the problem. Like that's the most important thing. Then we're leading by example. We're showing metrics-based behavior, and then people can follow that. So I think that's doing is much more important than telling in this case.
Totally. So I kind of two takeaways from what you mentioned. Number one is to be explicit and to actually consciously look for this in hiring and consciously have the conversation, culturally, and then show, if not tell, regardless of whether you tell or not, definitely show, in terms of
kind of like walk the walk, I guess is the
walk the walk. Exactly. Yeah. 100%. Totally makes sense. What are some ways to share your philosophy up the management chain with a goal to influencing change? So I know that having your team emulate you, not so hard in that people tend to do that anyways. But if you have, let's say, somebody above you who's doing something that you kind of feel like isn't really healthy or functional, or that you'd like to be different philosophically, how do you navigate and manage upwards?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's two interesting, kind of forks to this question. One is around if people who are above you or your peers are questioning how you're running your own organization, which happens, right? As an overall head of engineering, you might have a lot of autonomy, but then you have the CEO or the head of sales who's saying, hey, why are you doing things that way? Maybe they really having the entire team have one big deadline. and that's immovable and doesn't have, more of an agile aspect to it. Maybe they want things measured in a way that I don't agree with. So that's where there's a lot of it is around education. Like, hey, maybe the reason you brought me in was because you feel I'm good at this, but let me try to really educate you on why I feel this way. So if this is a way I think we should be run, let me sit down with you and walk you through why, and including some previous experience. So it's really taking the time to like seek out that misalignment. Like, maybe the CEO or maybe the head of sales doesn't actually understand it. Maybe they're misaligned. So instead of kind of ignoring that and hoping they don't bother me, let's like seek it out and tease it apart and then have the conversation. So that's kind of how I had to do that, numerous times with, peers on an exec team or a CEO. So that's kind of on that side. But the other interesting aspect to this question is around just like how I feel about how, things are going at my level with my peers and with, say, the CEO. And that's where I just think you have to be, even as a new joinee, you have to be willing to find your voice on what you think might change. If you think that this, certain meeting needs to go better, or you'd prefer things were this way, I always just suggest things, and I always do it with a smile on my face and good intentions. But just showing up and snapping in and trying to assimilate is not the job. I think at this level, you really need to come in and find a way to work with people, but bring new thoughts, new energy. Maybe it's just been done a certain way, and if you show up and have some new ideas, you actually get a lot of appetite. So I feel like that's a real key when joining a senior leadership team, is to bring new ideas and not be afraid to voice them.
Totally. The saying that's in my mind as you're talking was, talk about the elephants in the room, that like, as things come up that are sensitive and not spoken, right? I mean, in organizations, actually, just culturally, just in general, wherever we are, elephants in the room aren't talked about kind of by definition, right? And as a senior leader, it's you have an opportunity to share the elephants in the room that are unspoken. Particularly, I find this is really common with things as they relate to, for example, diversity and inclusion, where there are kind of unspoken things that are going on that don't feel great to a set of folks, for which there's another set of folks that are completely oblivious to that kind of stuff that's going on. And sometimes those folks who are being affected may not feel empowered or have the energy, because they're just kind of run down by having to deal with this over and over again, to surface this and to kind of pick that battle. And, as senior leaders, it's like we have the opportunity and kind of the obligation to create an environment that's comfortable enough that those things can somehow be identified and discovered, and then be that person to have those elephant in the room conversations and mention like, hey, this thing that's happening, or this unspoken philosophy that exists, whether we like it or not, needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and I even totally agree. And I feel like I even try to do this when I'm hiring for, a senior leader on my team, is you're really expecting this person to come in and add value, not just kind of take over an area and snap into your framework, but you're expecting them to add their own thoughts. And that's how you get the best people too, right? I mean, they have to be, again, you mentioned compatibility. They have to be compatible. But if they're just exactly like you, or they act exactly like you because they want to, fit in, that also is not really, you're not maximizing the value of that hire. You need to find, some more diverse thinking and have a setup where you're encouraging it to come up. And, I feel like that's part of leadership's job, is to get that dialogue going. And sometimes, again, I'd like to do it in front of everybody. Sometimes it comes up separately and you have to tease it out. But if there's elephants, we all have elephants that we're not talking about. And, someone shows up and like, hey, look over there. You got, thank you for saying, and you have to encourage that. So I feel like it's a big aspect of leadership.
Totally. And doing it in a compassionate way. Sometimes we forget about that part, right? Where we just kind of throw the elephants like charging into the room. But if done in a compassionate way, then it can sometimes be very well received, right?
Agreed. Yeah.
What fundamental shifts do you think that has started with COVID, but you believe will sustain past recovery, and we should take advantage of to thrive post-COVID?
Yeah, this is a big one. I'm sure we're all really thinking about this, and like, what is working now, and what of what's working now is translatable in like a longer term, as opposed to just, if you think about the current situation as time bound, at some point COVID, going to have a vaccine, it's going to be over. Or if you think about like, hey, what if this was like this for a long time? And how would that change my mindset around, doing what I do? So I think we're all thinking about that quite a bit. For me, going remote first has a lot of attraction to me. And like, since it happened to Optimizely, it was only like 5 weeks after I joined, by the way. It was very interesting, where we all just went home. And we have a bulk of our team in San Francisco. We have a small team in Austin. We had some teams where team membership was across both, and we had a few people in remote sites. And we had the problem, which is it happens everywhere, where if you're the one or two remote people on a team that is mostly co-located, you're in a world of hurt. You're always like, the one being forgotten about. You're missing the hallway conversations. You can't quite hear with the audio quality, and it really affects things. And you try to overcome that by like good Zoom and people flying around, but it's never as good as it could be. And so, boom, switch to having everybody remote first. And some companies have embraced this a long time ago. Suddenly it's a level playing field. And so I'm seeing that. I've kind of always thought that would be an interesting experiment. And now we're doing it in real time. And it's really, really working out, where, everyone is the same size picture on the screen. Everyone uses the same tools. And I think teams are really, really thriving. And also, I think they're really, really taking advantage of the fact that they have more flexibility and don't have these commutes, and can kind of quickly snap between things. I think it isn't all good though. We're all kind of have this tax over us where, there's burnout. You can't get out of your house. You really can't do the social bonding with people. Personally, if anybody has better answers on how to make Zoom happy hours really work, let me know, because I find them, I don't know. I don't want to start ranting.
They get old.
Intolerable. Like once you get past like 3 people, I actually wrote a feature request to Zoom on what I called happy hour mode. It's a story for another time. I think they're busy fixing their security vulnerabilities right now. But anyway, I feel like this remote first, everyone's on the same page thing is really effective. So how do we make that work post-COVID in a way where we can still get the social glue that we're missing right now? And so maybe that's like people are more distributed remotely, and you don't have as much dedicated big office space, but you still have some way to get people together, periodically. Maybe it's once a quarter, who knows, to really hang out and rub elbows with each other when that's possible. So I think that's some kind of magic balance there that I'm looking to strike, but we're definitely onto something. I think going back to how it was is not the way we should do it.
Makes sense. We have one attendee who mentioned happy hour icebreaker on my team. Everyone shows their pets, which is interesting. We have just a couple more minutes, so we'll see have as many questions we can squeeze in. Someone mentioned, I'm considering using teams that are outsourced. What is the best approach when identifying companies and talent?
Yeah, so what I would say there is start with the goals. Like why are you outsourcing? And everything should lead from that, because people do it for different reasons. Some people do it explicitly to save money. And if you're doing that, then you really need to look at, what you expect and kind of in that total cost of ownership. Think about the overhead of, where the team is and how they want to operate, and try to build a total cost of ownership model for yourself and use that to evaluate. And find someone who that aspect of it is what they focus on. But there's a lot of reasons to outsource that are not that. They are around, getting access to different pools of talent. It could be around you're in more of a customer facing model. You need follow the sun kind of setup. So think about why you're doing it and find a vendor that really matches to that.
Makes sense. When transitioning from being an individual contributor into an engineering manager / lead, how would you explain the necessary shifts in the mindset?
Yeah, what I say about this one is your job is not to be the smartest person in the room. And, as you could also maybe say that as like a senior engineer, you also don't want to like dominate everybody, but to some degree as a senior engineer, you are supposed to be like really competent, the trusted opinion on really tough issues. So in some cases you are supposed to be the smartest person in the room, even if you do it in a collaborative, nice way. But as a manager, you're really trying, it's your job that the team does the right thing, but without you actually being deep enough into the domain or actually doing the job, and to be, again, like the architect and the lead developer and the boss. It's really, there's a reason why those patterns around having separate career ladders have emerged. Like it's not your job anymore. So giving that up is hard for people. And there's some companies that just kind of have develop their management culture on like not worrying about that. Smartest engineer becomes the manager, smartest manager becomes the VP, and I just kind of reject that. I think you have to understand that like this is a different job you have now. And yeah, the fact that you used to be a really good engineer, very important, but that's not your job anymore.
Totally. And the set of skills required to be excellent as like a programmer, for example, can be or are completely different from being an effective people manager, right? So it's good to be sensitive to that. Last question. Since you joined Optimizely 6 months ago, what was your personal onboarding strategy to make sure you were successful?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because in this case, there was a period of time where the person who had the SVP role was overlapping with me for a while. And so I felt like I didn't have to come in and take the operational reins of the team right away. So I actually allowed myself a little bit more of an extended onboarding than I ordinarily would have, which is good because Optimizely's been on for 10 years. It's got a really deep set of technology that they use in their products. So there's a lot of reading and a lot of investigation, a lot of kind of archaeology. So I gave myself more time to do that than I would have in maybe a different kind of company. But I think it really paid off. So I spent more time, meeting with more people, reading more things, getting into the code a little bit before taking over all the meetings and assuming the role fully. So it was more like a 2 to 3 month onboarding instead of trying to really rush it.
Totally makes sense. Lawrence, thank you so much for your wisdom, your advice, your thoughts and reflections. All the attendees, thank you so much for joining. Very much appreciate all of your thoughts and definitely have a lot to sort of reflect on, right? When we think about philosophy as a whole and what our philosophies are, I appreciated, you reflecting on being very clear and explicit about what your philosophies are, being very clear about having the elephant in the room conversations that you need to have, and that, that it's good to look for matches in terms of that philosophy, but also you don't want all people that all think and do and act the same because, diversity is so important as well. So with that, thank you so much.